For decades, that was the sentence people reached for when they tried to explain what Robin Williams meant to them. And it was true, every word of it. But it was also, in the ways that matter most, nowhere near the whole story. Because the man who made the world laugh was carrying something beneath all of it. Something that ran in the opposite direction from everything the audience ever saw. Something that, according to the people who were closest to him, never fully surfaced in any interview, any performance. Any of the thousands of public moments that the world cataloged and celebrated and watched again on quiet evenings when they needed to feel something good. He died on August 11, 2014. The world found out. And then the world tried to understand what it was feeling and discovered that understanding wasn't coming quickly. The grief didn't behave the way grief usually behaves for someone you never personally knew. It sat differently. It stayed longer. It came back unexpectedly, weeks later, months later, in the middle of ordinary days that had nothing to do with him at all. But grief wasn't the only thing that followed his death. Questions came too, quiet ones first, then persistent ones. Then, as the people who had actually been present in his life began to speak, carefully, deliberately, choosing words with the kind of precision that signals awareness of exactly what is being revealed, those questions began pulling at something much larger than one man's private pain. What was actually happening inside Robin Williams' life in the years before he died? What did the people who loved him know, and when did they know it? And what has only fully come into the light in the years since, through medical disclosures, through testimony from those who were there, through scientific findings that reframe the entire story, is a truth considerably more layered than anything the public was given at the time. This is not a story built to diminish someone, it is a story built to finally see someone, completely. Without the distance that grief and legend, and the passage of time tend to place between a person and the truth of what they actually lived through. There is a particular cruelty in the way the world receives certain people. It receives them as sources of something it needs. Joy in Robin Williams' case, relief. The particular quality of laughter that doesn't just sit on the surface, but gets inside something and loosens it. The world asked for that from him constantly, in audition rooms and television studios and sold-out theaters, and at dinner parties where someone always wanted just a little more. Just one more impression, just one more flash of that extraordinary mind working at full speed. And he gave it generously, apparently without limit, but the cost of that giving was something most people never thought to ask about. Not because they didn't care about him, but because he was so genuinely good at making the cost invisible. The same qualities that made him extraordinary in front of an audience, the speed of his mind, the depth of his empathy. The way he absorbed the emotional frequency of every room he entered and reflected it back transformed, were also quietly and consistently the things that made him most vulnerable when the room emptied and the lights went down. He was born in Chicago in 1951. He grew up in the comfortable, quiet suburbs of Detroit and later San Francisco, a somewhat solitary kid in large houses who found, early, that making people laugh created a connection that nothing else quite replicated. He arrived in the world of performance as someone who seemed to operate on a different frequency from the people around him. Not louder exactly, just faster, sharper. More tuned in to the emotional undercurrents that most people moved through without noticing. His ability to inhabit other voices and other emotional states was not, by the accounts of people who knew him well, purely a performance technique. It was simply how he experienced the world. He felt things at a register that most people don't have access to, and he spent his career turning that sensitivity into art. Fame came quickly and never left. Which sounds like a simple good fortune from the outside, but which is, by virtually every honest account from people who have lived it, something considerably more complicated, a permanent alteration of ordinary life that takes years to fully understand and longer still to make peace with. Mork and Mindy, Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, Good Will Hunting, Mrs. Doubtfire, Aladdin's Genie, The Fisher King. The list of performances that embedded themselves across multiple generations is extraordinary in its range, dramatic and comic, large and intimate. Characters that millions of people grew up with and carried quietly into adulthood. But behind every entry on that list, behind the decades of love and recognition and sold-out nights, there was a life running at a cost that almost nobody fully understood. And in the years since his death, pieces of that life have come carefully into the light, through medical findings, through the testimony of his family. through the work of scientists who studied what was happening inside him and arrived at conclusions that changed the shape of everything. Not to take anything away from what he gave, but to finally, honestly understand what giving it required of him. By the early 2000s, Robin Williams had been famous for more than 2 decades, and from the outside. The later chapters of his life carried the particular texture of a man who had genuinely earned some peace. He had come through things that destroy careers and people alike, addiction that he spoke about publicly and without defensiveness, professional failures absorbed and learned from. The grinding reinvention that Hollywood demands and that most people cannot sustain across multiple decades. He had come through all of it, and what he appeared to have arrived at least from the outside looking in, was something solid, a life that had found its footing. He talked about his sobriety with the directness of someone who understood what was at stake and had decided that honesty served better than image management. He talked about his children with a tenderness so unguarded, it was almost startling in someone so publicly visible. He had married for the third time in 2011 to Susan Schneider. And the people who were around them during those years have consistently described a relationship that was real in the ways that matter, two people who had genuinely found each other and understood each other and were building something together. He was still working, the crazy ones on CBS, voice projects, public appearances where the wit was sharp, where the room still lit up the moment he walked in. From the outside, it looked like equilibrium, like a life that had found its rhythm after years of turbulence. But the people inside that picture tell a different story when they speak honestly about what they were observing. Susan has described it. His children have described it. Close friends have described it in the careful, measured language of people who are trying to be accurate about something they still don't fully have words for. Somewhere around 2013, something began to shift. Gradually at first, in ways that were easy to attribute to stress or aging or the accumulated weight of a long career. And then with increasing speed through 2014, in ways that none of them had the framework to explain. The sleep problems arrived first, or at least they were the first thing that registered clearly. Not ordinary insomnia, but something more persistent, more disorienting nights that didn't restore him, mornings that arrived without the clarity that mornings are supposed to bring. Then the memory. His memory had always been extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary. The kind that could hold thousands of voices and impressions and pieces of information simultaneously and access them instantly under pressure. It had been one of the foundational tools of his entire creative life, and it started showing gaps, small ones, moments of hesitation where before there had been only immediate fluency. He noticed. He noticed and said nothing publicly, but he noticed. The anxiety came in ways that didn't connect to any identifiable source. He had known anxiety before. Most people who perform at his level have a complicated relationship with it, but this was different in character. It arrived in the mornings in safe rooms, disconnected from any trigger he could name or address. He couldn't explain it, which for a man who had always been able to articulate the most interior emotional states with precision, was frightening in its own particular way. He began pulling back from some of the social energy that had always been central to who he was, not completely, not visibly to the wider world. But the people who knew him felt the change, a fatigue that sat behind the performance even when the performance itself still appeared intact. He mentioned in scattered conversations with Susan and with a few close friends that his body felt wrong, not dramatically, not with alarm. Just a persistent, vague, deeply uncomfortable sense that something inside the machinery was not operating as it should. At the time, everyone around him took those comments seriously and filed them inside a framework of general anxiety. There was no other framework available yet. Nobody knew what they were actually pointing toward. Robin Williams was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the months before he died. That diagnosis became part of the public narrative shortly after his death, a piece of the story the world was given to hold alongside its grief. A beloved man, a serious illness. A pain that the people who loved him had been trying to help him carry. But the Parkinson's diagnosis, it turned out, was only the surface of the actual story. What was happening inside Robin Williams, what the autopsy conducted after his death revealed, and what has since been discussed in medical literature and in documentary testimony from both Susan and the physicians involved, was something that the doctors examining him during his lifetime did not fully identify in time. Something that has become, in the years since, one of the most significant and widely discussed cases in the clinical study of neurodegenerative disease. Not because of who he was, though his name brought attention that accelerated awareness considerably, but because of what his case revealed about an illness that had been, for years, profoundly and systematically misunderstood: Lewy body dementia. Not Parkinson's, though the two share enough surface features to cause genuine diagnostic confusion. Not depression as a primary condition, though depression is one of the things it reliably generates. Not addiction resurfacing in some new form. Lewy body dementia, a disease caused by the accumulation of abnormal protein deposits across the regions of the brain that govern movement, mood, memory, sleep, and the basic autonomic functions that the body performs without conscious instruction. It mimics Parkinson's in certain physical ways. It mimics depression in its emotional presentation. It generates hallucinations that arrive without warning and feel completely real to the person experiencing them. It produces anxiety that has no external cause because its cause is neurological, not circumstantial. It dismantles memory in patterns that are irregular and deeply frightening, not the gradual, predictable erosion of some other diseases, but something more sudden, more bewildering, harder to track. And in Robin Williams' case, the neuropathologist who examined his brain after death described what they found as among the most severe presentations of the disease they had ever encountered. Every region of his brain showed involvement. The progression had been extraordinarily aggressive, far beyond what the visible symptom timeline had suggested was possible. Susan Williams has spoken about all of this. The courage that speaking required and continues to require should not be understated. She has described watching her husband fight something that neither of them could name, something generating symptoms that seemed to contradict each other. That shifted from day to day without pattern, that resisted every explanation they reached for. A man whose mind had been the instrument of his entire life was experiencing that instrument turning against him in real time, and without an accurate diagnosis, there was no map. No framework for what was happening or what it might become. The Parkinson's framework had accounted for some of what he was experiencing, the physical symptoms partially. But it didn't account for the hallucinations. It didn't account for the paranoia that had begun surfacing. It didn't account for the cognitive gaps that were arriving with increasing frequency or the quality of fear. And Susan has used that specific word. Terror that had settled into his eyes in the final weeks of his life. He was not simply depressed, he was not simply anxious. He was fighting a battle that had no name yet, inside a mind that was being dismantled by something neither he nor the people around him could see clearly enough to address. And that gap between what was actually happening and what anyone understood to be happening is where the real weight of his final year lies. Lewy body dementia does not move in a straight line, and that matters enormously to understanding what Robin Williams actually experienced. Most diseases that the mind and body produce have at least a recognizable arc, a progression that, however painful, allows the people living inside it to orient themselves. To know roughly what to expect, to build some structure around the uncertainty. Lewy body dementia doesn't offer that, it fluctuates, a morning of relative clarity. An afternoon where the floor disappears entirely. An evening where the person seems almost like themselves again, present, engaged, recognizable, and then another drop without warning. The instability is not a side feature of the disease. It is one of its defining characteristics. And for families and caregivers, that fluctuation is, in many ways, one of the cruelest aspects of the entire experience. Because it makes consistent assessment nearly impossible and creates false floors of hope that give way without notice. For Robin Williams specifically, a man whose identity had been built over 5 decades entirely around the speed and reliability of his mind, that fluctuation was something beyond frightening. He knew something was wrong. The accounts from people who were with him are consistent on that point. He could feel the gaps. He could feel the moments where something that had always been instantly available was suddenly inaccessible, and the hesitation that followed, and the private terror of not understanding why. What he couldn't feel was the actual cause, and without a name for what was happening, his mind did what minds do in the absence of accurate information. It generated its own explanations. According to Susan's accounts, he began interpreting the symptoms as personal failures, as evidence of weakness, as things that a person with real discipline and real will should be able to overcome, which meant that whatever he was experiencing was not just terrifying, but also, in some interior accounting, his fault. That is the particular cruelty of it. Not just the disease, but the way the disease disguised itself as a character flaw to the person carrying it. He had always pushed through hard things. That capacity for pushing through had defined him. And now, without knowing that pushing through was no longer the right tool, that the thing he was facing didn't respond to effort or will or the force of a disciplined mind, he was reaching for an approach that the disease had already taken off the table. The people around him were doing everything available to them. Susan has said this clearly and consistently, and it matters that it be heard clearly. The medical professionals working with him were operating from the best framework they had, which was the Parkinson's diagnosis. Treatment proceeded accordingly. Everyone was trying. But the treatment for Parkinson's is not the treatment for Lewy body dementia, and in some documented cases, certain medications used in Parkinson's management can meaningfully worsen Lewy body symptoms rather than address them. Nobody knew this yet, not Susan, not his doctors, not the people who loved him and were trying every day to find the right way to help. He was navigating terrain that no one around him could fully see, with tools that had been built for a different landscape entirely. Carrying a fear he couldn't name toward an end that no one around him understood was coming as fast as it was. 2 years after her husband's death, Susan Schneider-Williams sat down and wrote something that took real courage to write, and has mattered enormously to people she will never meet. She published a piece in the journal Neurology titled "The Terrorist Inside My Husband's Brain." The title is not metaphorical or dramatic. It is simply the most accurate description she found for what she had witnessed from the inside, a disease operating inside the mind of someone she loved with the specific, systematic destructiveness of something that had decided to take everything. She did not write it as a grieving widow managing a public narrative. She wrote it as a witness, as someone who had been present for something that the medical community and the wider public needed to understand in ways they currently did not, and who had arrived at a place where staying quiet felt like a choice she could not make in good conscience. She described the final months with a specificity that is genuinely difficult to sit with and genuinely impossible to look away from. She described the fluctuation, the confusing, destabilizing rhythm of a good morning giving way to an afternoon of profound disorientation, followed by an evening that offered just enough clarity to make the next collapse harder to absorb. She described how that pattern made consistent assessment impossible for everyone around him. How the moments of relative normalcy kept resetting everyone's understanding of how serious things actually were. How the disease kept offering false ground that would hold for a few hours and then give way. She described his fear in terms that are specific and human, and far more illuminating than any clinical description could be, the particular experience of a man who had spent his entire life living through his mind, finding that mind increasingly unreliable, and having no language yet for what that unreliability meant or where it was going. She described his guilt, the way he was working to reconcile who he had always known himself to be with what he was experiencing in real time, and the gap between those two things, and what that gap cost him. And then she described his courage, because this part of the story is just as true as everything else and it would be wrong to leave it out. He continued to show up, for Susan, for his children, for the people in his life who needed him to still be present even when presence was requiring more than it ever had before. He continued to try every day with whatever he had available that day, even as what was available kept diminishing. Susan's decision to be this public, this precise, this unflinching was not accidental. She understood what she was choosing to do and why it mattered. She wanted Lewy body dementia to have a face that people could place. She wanted clinicians to take the fluctuating symptom pattern seriously as a diagnostic signal, rather than as a complicating inconsistency to be noted and set aside. She wanted families sitting in darkened rooms with a loved one whose behavior had stopped making sense to have somewhere to turn, a name, a framework, a place to begin. And she wanted the world to understand, with the same clarity she had arrived at through the hardest experience of her life, that the man it was grieving was not defeated by something inside himself. That the will that had carried him through 5 decades of extraordinary achievement had not failed him. That what had taken him was external to his character, however internal to his body. He was fighting a disease that his own brain couldn't identify, that the medical system hadn't yet learned to see clearly enough. And that moved faster and further than anyone around him understood, until it was too late to change what happened. In the years since Robin Williams' death, His case has become one of the most referenced in the medical literature surrounding Lewy body dementia. The clinical significance of what his autopsy revealed extended well beyond his individual story. His case demonstrated, with an unusually clear and well-documented record, the degree to which this disease had been hiding in plain sight, generating symptoms that were being attributed to depression, to anxiety, to the psychological complexity of people with difficult histories, while the actual neurological process continued its work unchecked and unaddressed. Researchers studying his case noted something that carries its own particular weight. The severity of the Lewy body pathology found throughout his brain was inconsistent with the relatively brief window during which overt symptoms had been visible. The disease had almost certainly been developing quietly, below the clinical threshold where current tools could detect it, for considerably longer than the visible symptom timeline suggested. And that finding opens a question that has been discussed carefully in several medical and biographical contexts since. How much of what was attributed over the years to Robin Williams' psychology, the manic creative energy that seemed to exceed what ordinary humans could sustain? The periods of withdrawal that followed peaks of extraordinary output. The particular quality of anxiety that people close to him had noted at various points across his career was actually something else. Something neurological, already present and already shaping his experience of the world, decades before anyone had the language or the tools to see it. That question does not rewrite his choices or reduce his achievements or locate their source outside of him. He was genuinely extraordinary. That was genuinely his. But the question does invite a compassion that is different in quality from the compassion grief usually generates, a compassion that doesn't wait for suffering to be explained and verified before it extends itself. Susan has kept speaking. She has kept returning to this material at real personal cost. Because the work of raising awareness for Lewy body dementia research requires exactly that continued presence in the hardest rooms of her own experience. For the benefit of people she will never know personally, but who are living through their own versions of what she witnessed. She has said in different ways across different interviews that her hope is simple and specific. That what happened to her husband, made public and made comprehensible, might reach the people who are sitting right now in their own dark uncertainty, trying to explain something in a loved one that no one has given them the right name for yet. That hope is an extraordinary thing to build from unbearable loss. And it carries in its own quiet and determined way the same fundamental impulse that animated everything Robin Williams ever did in front of an audience, the impulse to take something painful and turn it outward, not for performance, but for connection, to reach across whatever distance exists between one human being and another, and offer something true. Something that says without saying it directly that whatever you are carrying, you are not carrying it alone. Even now, through the awareness his death helped generate, that reaching continues. There is a version of Robin Williams' story that the world received in the days and weeks after August 2014. A beloved man, a private battle. A loss that landed with a weight and a personal quality that surprised even the people who felt it. Millions of strangers who had never been in the same room with him, but who grieved him the way you grieve someone who knew you. Because his work had that quality, it reached people inside themselves and stayed there. That version of the story was not wrong. But it was incomplete in ways that matter, incomplete in ways that, left unaddressed, ask the wrong questions and point toward the wrong conclusions about what actually happened and what it means. The complete version is harder to sit with, not because it reveals something shameful or reduces him in any way, but because it reveals something genuinely tragic in the oldest and truest sense of that word, a person of extraordinary gifts, fighting an invisible enemy with no map, no correct diagnosis, and a mind that had been turned against itself by a disease that neither he nor the people who loved him most could see clearly enough to name. What Robin Williams experienced in his final year was not a failure of character. It was not the inevitable destination of some darkness that people sometimes project onto comedians as a kind of retrospective narrative that makes the ending feel like it was always coming. It was a disease. A specific, now identifiable, extraordinarily aggressive neurological disease that was dismantling him from the inside while everyone who loved him watched and tried and reached for frameworks that were simply not right. That matters. It matters in the way that accuracy about suffering always matters. Because the stories we tell about how people struggle and why they suffer shape how we see the people around us who might be struggling right now, without anyone having the right name for it yet. Robin Williams was 63 years old. He had given, across 4 decades, more than anyone could reasonably ask of a single person. He had made millions of people feel less alone through characters and voices, and a quality of presence that translated through screens and speakers into something that felt, and continues to feel, genuinely warm, genuinely human, genuinely there. And in the end, he was failed by the limits of what medicine knew and what language could reach. Susan's decision to go back into the hardest rooms of her own loss, repeatedly and publicly, and to bring something useful back from those rooms for the benefit of strangers, that is one of the most quietly remarkable acts of generosity in this entire story. She didn't owe it to anyone. She chose it, because she understood that the truth of what had happened to the man she loved was capable of protecting other people if it was told honestly and in full. The truth that took time and courage and science to finally surface is this: Robin Williams fought harder than the public narrative ever captured. Against something more specific, more merciless, and more invisible than anyone understood while it was happening. He deserves to be held in memory with that knowledge fully present. Not as a man broken by something within him, but as a man who was, every single day until the very last one, still trying. If this story shifted something in you, not just in how you understand Robin Williams, but in how you think about what people carry when no one can see it, take a moment and leave that in the comments. It doesn't need to be a complete thought. Sometimes just naming what you felt is enough. And if this kind of storytelling, careful, unhurried, built around what's true rather than what's convenient, is something you want more of, subscribing means you'll be here when the next one arrives. No sensationalism, no shortcuts to easy conclusions. Just stories given the space and the honesty they deserve and the people inside them seen as fully as possible.